Good afternoon, everyone. Today's Monday, June 15th. I'm going to be giving you a lecture for tomorrow's reading on John Stuart Mill's Utilitarianism, which is the last normative ethical theory that we'll be dealing with in this class. Um, just as a reminder, in terms of the class, you have 3 reading posts this week on John Stuart Mill. You will have an exam Friday, and then the last thing in the course that is due by Monday, a week from today, by noon, is your paper on the film. I uploaded the directions and the prompts that go along with the film. You'll need to complete 3 essays on the film. If you have any questions about that, please let me know, but you will need to watch the film itself, and you will need to reference specific details from the film in your essays. Please let me know if you have any questions about that. But with that said, I want to go ahead and move into the third normative theory that we're dealing with in the course. I mentioned at the outset the course is organized according to the 3 main traditional ethical theories in philosophy, which are Aristotle, Kant, and utilitarianism, or without it's virtue ethics, duty-based ethics, and consequence-based or utilitarian-based ethic. It might be helpful first to just kind of contrast what's going on in utilitarianism with what we've done to this point. So sometimes the easiest way to think about ethics is to think about the very structure of any action. An action involves an agent, who is the person making the choice or performing the action. So there's an agent, there is the action itself, and there are the consequences that result from the action. We might say that virtue ethics is more of a virtue, or more of an agent-centered ethics, which is to say it is concerned with the character of the person making the choices, the traits, the habits that the agent has over the course of their life that promote their character, and that we evaluate choices and actions based on the agent's character. So that's one. So you've got the agent, you've got the action, and then you've got the consequences. So if virtue ethics is focused on the agent, then we might say that a duty-based ethics is focused more on the motive or the choice behind the action. It's more focused on the agent, but not in terms of their character, but in terms of the reasons that they have for the action that they choose. And so duty-based ethics is more of a motive or intention-based ethics, whereas virtue ethics is more of a character or agent-centered ethics. And whereas utilitarianism focuses less on the agent and not even on the action itself, but on the consequences that are produced as a result of the action, or it's focused more on the goals of our actions, right? It's focused in particular on the utility that is produced. So when it's utility simply means utility is used as a synonym for happiness or pleasure in this case. So utility refers to the good consequences that are produced as a result of the actions that we perform and the choices that we make. So utilitarianism locates its normativity in the consequences that are produced as a result. But utilitarianism is similar to virtue ethics. It's similar to Aristotle in that it does start with happiness as the starting point for thinking about ethics. In other words, we can't think about ethics and morality apart from thinking about human happiness. The 2 questions are inextricably linked. In order to ask about ethics, in order to ask about morality, we have to ask about human happiness. So if we're trying to locate a standard of human conduct and human choice and human action, if that's what and that's what normative ethics is about, is trying to locate a standard to evaluate our choices and our actions, then we're going to locate that in human happiness. And it's going to be fundamentally located in human nature. Similar to Aristotle. Aristotle also starts with happiness, but I need to make a distinction between Aristotle and John Stuart Mill's conceptions of happiness. Because Aristotle located happiness in a kind of teleological um, uh, concept of human nature, which is to say, the human being as fulfilling a certain kind of function in terms of reasoning, in terms of acting virtuously, and happiness is intimately connected to human virtue in the sense that we can't be happy unless we are fulfilling our function and unless we're being virtuous. And for John Stuart Mill, happiness is not so. So John Stuart Mill says, yes, we start with happiness. Nothing could be more obvious than beginning with happiness as the normative standard that we're going to use to evaluate human action. But yet, happiness for John Stuart Mill will be grounded in a theory of human nature that has nothing to do with virtue or fulfilling human function or reasoning well. Um, uh, Happiness for Mill will simply be located in a fairly obvious empirical observation about human beings, that we seek pleasure and we avoid pain. That's not only John Stuart Mill's, but that's a forerunner of Mill, Jeremy Bentham. Mill sort of is revising utilitarianism a little bit. He's sort of he is a um, a philosophical brethren of Jeremy Bentham, and I'll say more about Bentham in a second. And if you take a look at the notes in chapter 2 of Utilitarianism, you'll see Bentham's name mentioned. But Mill and Bentham use take as an obvious starting point that human beings desire pleasure and want to avoid pain. And they take that empirical fact about human beings, they take that as a source of normativity for figuring out what ought human beings to do when they make choices and actions. So we cannot ask about morality apart from the fact that the one fundamental truth about us is that we desire pleasure and want to avoid pain. In that for them it makes no sense to ask about morality and ethics without taking that into account, because that is something that is universally true of human beings. So what could be a more obvious, intuitive starting point than this empirical fact about us that we, again, desire pleasure and avoid pain? So similar to Aristotle, but yet different. Yes, that we're going to locate the source of normativity, the standard of ethics, in asking about human nature, but it is a fundamentally different concept of human nature. It is not a teleological concept of human nature. It is more of a psychological concept of human nature, in the sense that it is asking that we desire pleasure and avoid pain. So just to make that point clear, and that's so in today's reading, John Stuart Mill, what he's trying to show is in fact that he's sort of, John Stuart Mill, at the time that he wrote this, he's sort of taking stock of moral philosophy or ethics at the time, and the fact that moral philosophy can't seem to make any progress in locating what this standard is. And that's what he's going to give us in this book, is that he's going to say utilitarianism, or the principle of utility, is the standard. But what he's reflecting on in those first 5 pages of chapter 1 is simply how sad a state of affairs moral philosophy and ethics is in at the time that he's writing this. And he's essentially saying that they all talk about having standards. In particular, he references Kant by name in the first chapter of today's reading. If you look at page 5, or if you look at page 4, he references Kant by name, and he wants to talk about how um, that morality is about rule following and about principles, but he wants to ultimately say that every system of moral philosophy, whether they admit it or not, they presuppose the utilitarian standard. Um, so I'm taking a look at so I do have the text here, and I'm just taking a look at pages 3 and 4 here, and I mean, at the end of the day, that is what Mill wants to argue, is that Mill wants to say that all moral theories ultimately derive um, the force of their normative theories. The normative theories derive their force of what is right and wrong ultimately from arguments about happiness and consequences, even if they don't admit it. And that's ultimately what he's going to show, right? So to give an example of that, he says, look, Kant argues, and he goes on here to show on page 4. He says, Kant had went on to say, and this was the example that you guys talked about in the exam, was that the reason it's wrong to lie, for example, the reason that it's wrong to tell a lie is that, and this wasn't the formula of humanity, but it was the formula of universal law, is that universalizing one's maxim leads to a contradiction in the maxim, and therefore that's why it's wrong to lie. We wouldn't want to live in a world where everyone lies. And what Mill is saying here is that actually Kant himself was making an argument. He was making a consequentialist based argument, a utility argument, even though he himself would not say that. So on page 4 he writes. He says, for example, all he shows, and this is the last paragraph, this is the last sentence of the first paragraph on page 4, all he shows is that the consequences of their universal adoption would be such as no one would choose to incur. So he says, look, Kant says that there's this logical contradiction in your maxim, but in fact, all Kant has shown is that in other words, all Kant has shown is that we would not want to live in a world in which everyone is a liar. And that is a consequence-based argument, right? It has nothing to do with the maxim. So Kant himself made this kind of argument, but didn't admit it. And so again, Mill wants to say that the utilitarian principle, happiness, ultimately underlies all moral theories. So even though, for example, we might say that Kant is onto something when talking, Kant's ethics is onto something when talking about rule following, that it's good to follow certain rules, like for example, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Might be, and that's not Kant, but that's another example of a rule. Kant has the rule that we should treat others as ends in themselves and never as mere means. Mill wants to say, ultimately underlying that, why do we follow those rules? What is it about following certain rules in ethics? It's about happiness. It's because it makes the world a better place when we follow those rules. So the rules presuppose this other unstated premise and this unstated principle. And that unstated premise and unstated principle is the principle of utility. So that's kind of what's going on in chapter 1. Mill wants to talk about the state of moral philosophy and how ultimately he wants to show that the principle of utility is the supreme principle. But I'm more worried about chapter 2, because chapter 2 gets into a lot of there's a lot going on in chapter 2. I had you stop, if you pay it, I had you stop on page 17. There's more to chapter 2, but I wanted you to stop there because for the purposes of this class, that's all I really am asking you about. But chapter 2, he's getting into he wants to come right out and firmly say, here's what utilitarianism is. So on page 7, you have one of the most well-known statements of utilitarianism, and it says, "The creed which accepts as the foundation of morals utility, or the greatest happiness principle, holds that actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness. By happiness is intended pleasure and the absence of pain. By unhappiness, pain and the privation of pleasure." So there you go. So it's kind of the utilitarian standard is built upon this simple definition of happiness, that happiness equals pleasure and uh, pain equals lack of happiness, right? And so you take happiness as the starting point and you build the utilitarian moral standard off of that fact, right? And so there it is, right? And in that same paragraph, he's going to go on to talk about a theory of life. So the theory of life is the theory of human nature, in other words, that I was referencing before, upon which we derive the utilitarian standard of ethics. Right? So he says these supplementary explanations do not affect the theory of life on which this theory of morality is grounded. So the theory of morality cannot be separated from the theory of human nature. Now, quickly, what Mill's going to do here is pivot, and he wants to quickly clarify what he means by pleasure and utility. First of all, he wants to say pleasure and utility don't mean anything different. They mean the same thing. But this is where utilitarianism is almost immediately attacked as um, very hedonistic, which is to say that the only thing that matters is pleasure. And there is a sense in which utilitarianism is hedonistic, hedonistic, that it is a kind of hedonism because it says that the most important part of a moral theory is the pleasure that is produced as a result of the actions in the human being. It's the pleasurable feeling and state that we find ourselves in as a result of the things that we choose, right? Uh, But um, but utilitarianism is often attacked as quote unquote a doctrine for swine, which is to say, pigs or beasts. Um, and this is how Jeremy Bentham's utilitarianism was attacked. Again, remember, Mill is largely in agreement with Bentham about utilitarianism, but he's amending utilitarianism a little bit on this specific point that utilitarianism need not only recommend that human beings choose, the base pleasures, which is to say that Jeremy Bentham, um, for Jeremy Bentham, the choices we make, the only way, the way that we determine whether or not the choice is good is based on the pleasure that it gives the person who performs the action. So, and it's strictly a quantitative evaluation of the pleasure. In other words, how much pleasure did I get? How long did it last? How intense was it? He makes no distinction between the kinds of pleasure, only that pleasure is produced and how long the pleasure lasts. So he makes no distinction between certain kinds of activities that produce pleasure. And this is where Mill wants to step in and amend Bentham's utilitarianism slightly, which is to say we can make a distinction between different kinds of pleasures, right? And so on page 8, for example, Mill writes, human beings have faculties more elevated than the animal appetites, and when once made conscious of them, do not regard anything as happiness, which does not include their gratification. So what he's saying is, once we become aware of our more elevated faculties, which is to say our reason and our intellect, that we would not count as happy anything that only satisfies, for example, our senses. The fact, eating and drinking a lot, for example, would be anything that just makes you feel good, right? Once we are aware of the fact that we are different from animals and different from beasts, that we will not regard all happiness the same. In other words, all happiness is not created equal, so to speak, right? So he goes on to say, that we can make a distinction between quality and quantity of pleasures. So at the bottom of that paragraph on page 8, he says, it would be absurd that while in estimating all other things, quality is considered as well as quantity. The estimation of pleasure it would be absurd that while in estimating all other things, quality is considered as well as quantity. The estimation of pleasure should depend on quantity alone. right? So he's saying, look, it would be absurd to recognize this distinction between the human faculties of having a higher intellect, being satisfied by things that appeal to our intellect, but yet not at the same time want to grant that we shouldn't talk about the pleasures that we should be promoting as a result of our choices as simply ones that are based upon the things that only satisfy our senses. So we have to make this distinction between quality and quantity of pleasures. And he goes on here and he says, well, on what basis am I making this? And the basis he's making is that some things, for example, reading philosophy, going to an opera, um, are going to they are qualitatively different. They appeal to our intellect and are therefore better in nature than things simply like sitting around and gorging yourself on fast food or watching television all the time. That there is just a simply a different on an experiential level. Those things are better, right? But then he says, if I'm asked what I mean by difference of quality and pleasures, and I'm still reading from page 8 here, the last paragraph, or what makes one pleasure more valuable than another, um, merely as a pleasure, except its being greater in amount, there is but one possible answer. Of two pleasures, if there be one to which all or almost all who have experience of both give a decided preference, irrespective of any feeling or moral obligation, that is the more desirable pleasure. And what Mill is going to go on to, so he is saying this is a kind of, he's saying there is this idea that there are higher pleasures, but yet he can't just assert that. He wants to say that if more people prefer one to the other, that will be the more preferable one. That should be the one we promote. But he is going to say ultimately that men of experience over the course of a lifetime will give will tend to give more preference to things, pleasures, and activities that satisfy the higher faculties. That over the course of a lifetime, those will be the things that satisfy us more. And ultimately, this is a kind of that if we aren't pursuing those kinds of pleasures and promoting those kinds of activities, somehow we're actually failing to be a good human being because we have intellect and we have reason. And to not promote activities and pleasures that appeal to the intellect and to our reason, we're actually failing as human beings because we actually aren't using our the capacities that we have. If all we're doing is going around and having sex and drinking and eating all the time and watching television and living the most base life that only appeals to our senses, then we're no better than pigs. Then utilitarianism is a doctrine for swine. So, given the fact of intellect and reason, we must promote and pursue activities that appeal to the intellect, right? And this is a very famous line that even if we're not happy, even if an activity doesn't make us happy, he goes on, and this is a very famous line from Mill on page 10, the bottom of the first paragraph on page 10. He says, "It is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. And if the fool or the pig are of a different opinion, it is because they only know their own side of the question. The other party to the comparison knows both sides." So what he's saying here is even if we aren't happy intellectually, that is still better than simply being only satisfied by the pleasures of the senses, like the pig. Right, so better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied, right? Better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. So this distinction between quality and quantity of happiness is really really important. It's what really makes John Stuart Mill's contribution to utilitarianism significant, because he's really amending the theory quite significantly from what Bentham had said. Is that Bentham made no distinction, whereas Mill is saying, no, there is this distinction to be made. These are the kinds of things that we should be promoting. But yet then on page 11, Mill wants to, Mill really is dwelling on this point. He wants to convince you that there's this distinction between quantity and quality of pleasure. But then on page 11 at the bottom, the second full paragraph, or the third full paragraph at the bottom, he says, "I have dwelt on this point enough as being necessary. I have dwelt on this point enough as being necessary part of a perfectly just conception of utility or happiness, considered as the directive rule of human conduct." Then he says, "It is by no means an indispensable condition to the acceptance of the utilitarian standard. for that standard is not the agent's own greatest happiness, but the greatest amount of happiness altogether. So what Mill wants to say, look, I need to convince you of quantity and quality of happiness, but I'm not. But what utilitarianism is not egoism. And egoistic moral theories suggest that the things that human beings ought to do are the things that produce only their own happiness and their own pleasure. And Mill is saying here, look, even though I'm dwelling on this point about, even though I'm dwelling long on this point about the fact that human beings ought to choose and promote activities that appeal to their own intellect and their own pleasures, that's not ultimately what utilitarianism as a moral theory is about. He wants to take that insight and say what we ought to be doing is promoting pleasures and promoting activities that are good for everyone, the greatest amount of people. So it has nothing to do simply with what I prefer. So utilitarianism is not the same as egoism. It is not recommending that and that's specifically what he says, the standard utilitarian standard is not the agent's own greatest happiness, but the greatest amount of happiness altogether, right? So that is the point. So, and what will be in particular important here, and I'm going to jump ahead just a little bit, what's going on pages 11 through 15, up to the end of today's reading, Mill is considering some objections to utilitarianism, and those are important. But I do want to jump ahead just a little bit to page 17, where Mill says, and this was right where I had you cut off, I must again repeat what the assailants of utilitarianism seldom have the justice to acknowledge, that the happiness which forms the utilitarian standard of what is right in conduct is not the agent's own happiness, but that of all concerned. As between his own happiness and that of others, utilitarianism requires to be as strictly impartial as a disinterested and benevolent spectator. So that's on page 17, the first full paragraph on 17. So when we're trying to figure out from a utilitarian standpoint what would be the best action or the best choice, what we have to do is we have to count everyone's happiness equally. My happiness doesn't count any more than your happiness. So utilitarianism, when he says a disinterested and benevolent spectator, he's asking you to bracket your own interests, that yours count no more than everyone involved in the decision or in the calculation, however many people that may be. You may be trying to make a decision about where to go to dinner with your family, and you have to think about, that's only going to involve a finite amount of people. But it gets more calculated the more people you have to get involved. Utilitarianism is often used as a kind of societal standard, and so trying to make those calculations once you get more people involved is harder. But utilitarianism demands of you, the person making the calculation, that you treat me and her and him and everyone else the same, that we all start from an equal place. So that's just something crucial to point out. That is a crucial line, that we be a disinterested and benevolent spectator. So and that's not always going to be easy to do, because we do want to look out for ourselves first. But your happiness counts no more than mine, and so it is not an egoistic theory in that sense. If it was egoistic, it would say that utilitarianism, if it was egoistic, it would recommend choosing the actions that promote your happiness the most, whereas utilitarianism is asking what action promotes the most amount of happiness for the greatest amount of people. And that will not be easy to figure out, because here's the thing, there will not always be a good choice. So Mill will be clear about that, and that it won't always be true. It won't always be true that there will be a best choice that will promote the greatest amount of happiness. Sometimes we will simply have to reduce the amount of suffering, right? So any choice that might not promote happiness, but any choice which results in the least amount of pain or suffering is also the best choice. And that is a crucial thing to say, because from a utilitarianism perspective, there often will be maybe two or three bad choices. And the question is, out of those bad options, which one is the least bad? Which one produces the least amount of pain or unhappiness? right? So it's often about preventing pain, not always about producing happiness, because we won't always be in situations where we can produce happiness. And that is often seen, for example, in the trolley problem. And you may be familiar with this. The trolley problem imagines you to asks you to imagine being a somebody who's standing by, and you are witnessing a train going down the tracks, speeding ahead towards 8 innocent bystanders. And yet, as the person who has the control, you can pull the lever, and the train will immediately go to the right and potentially kill only one person. Now, clearly, that is not a good option, but it is a better option than killing 8 people. Now, often with the trolley problem, many individuals are uncomfortable because it's asking you to kill, and you don't want to be in this situation. But it's simply trying to test your intuitions that at least that less people suffer than otherwise would. And so if we can prevent suffering, that's what we should do. So I just want to be clear about that, right? So that's really all I have in today's reading. I really, there's a sense in which utilitarianism seems more intuitive than maybe the other two. I mean, I don't know, but because you're often thinking in terms of consequences, we talk about pro and con lists and cost benefit analyses, and those are often forms of utilitarianism. But again, the crucial point is that your happiness doesn't count any more than anyone else's. And so, utilitarianism, big picture points here: normativity located in human nature, happiness equals pleasure, distinction between quantity and quality of pleasure. We should be promoting pleasures and activities that appeal more to our intellect. So happiness is not simply going to be, the activities that only appeal to our base senses and things like that, and that there is the demand that your happiness doesn't count more than anyone else's, and that oftentimes we can't promote happiness, but we do have to reduce suffering. And so that's all I have for today's reading. I will have another lecture for Wednesday's reading on the distinction between sanctions. That will be important, but let me know if you have any questions in the meantime.